Hello, hello. Welcome to Biblically Speaking. My name's Cass Amblino and I'm your host. Today's topic that we have on the agenda is understanding Moses with Dr. Gary Yates. And I wanted to discuss this topic because life is just simply too astounding to look past. I mean, the things that Moses saw and experienced as you read Genesis and as you read Exodus is incredible. And for me, rereading the Bible and starting at the beginning, there's just so many questions that I have that Moses experienced that I don't experience today. So Dr. Gary Yates, welcome back to the podcast. You were just on talking about prophecy, and I'm so glad that you were like, oh, I know Moses. And so now here we are again. How are you today?
I'm doing great. It's great to be with you. Thanks for inviting me back. Yeah, I really enjoyed the conversation we had about the prophets. So looking forward to talking about Moses,
Yeah,
the
Moses
great,
is
the greatest Old Testament prophet of all. So,
truly, that is, yeah, that's something you can absolutely claim. How did you tell me about what you know about Moses? Was this something that you focused on in your studies, or is this something that you just recently started teaching?
no, my main focus with Moses has been developing how other figures in the Old Testament mirror Moses and Moses imagery and typology. I did my dissertation on the book of Jeremiah, so a major theme in the book of Jeremiah is that Jeremiah is a prophet like Moses, and in ways that both sort of make him look like a failure, but also and ultimately in ways that
Mm.
promise things that are even greater than what God did in the days of Moses. And so we see a lot of this Moses typology. It's in the book of Joshua. It's in the book of Judges. You have this in the book of Isaiah, the new Exodus, and those types of things. And then really, I think Moses almost becomes sort of a paradigm for reading the whole Bible, because this Moses typology carries over into the New Testament because Jesus is the ultimate prophet like Moses. So we're almost talking about a theme that in many ways I
Yeah.
think ties together the whole Bible.
Truly. And Moses is such a prominent figure that really does set the standard for all the other prophets. And then, like you said, like
Right.
Jesus. But for me, it seemed like he was just kind of another character that blended into the background. We just simply don't focus on it enough in church. And as a Christian that, let's say, only goes to Bible study, only goes to church, when you talk about Moses, it's like sometimes if you want to talk about some of, the parting of the Red Sea, but it's not,
Right.
like you have seen it in multiple other books and the way that it kind of sets the stage for Jesus. But do you think we're just overlooking it, or do you think we just don't understand Moses's life and the significance of it?
Well, part of it for a lot of us as Christians is that we associate Moses with the law, and we think that the
I'm
Old
sorry.
Testament is about the law and works, whereas the New Testament is about grace and faith. But actually, I think the way that law and grace and faith and works operate in the Old Covenant is very similar to the way that it operates in the New Covenant as well. So in John, it says, the law came by Moses, but grace and truth came by Jesus Christ. But it's not saying that there was no grace with the law. It's just simply saying that with Jesus, that grace and truth comes in an even greater way. But Moses sees the grace of God in some pretty amazing ways as well.
Absolutely. I let's imagine that I'm somebody that all I've seen is like that Disney movie that just talks about the Prince of Egypt. And I just recently rewatched it of like Moses's life and going down the Nile and becoming, a brother to Pharaoh and kind of like running off and finding Zipporah. Like, do you feel like that was an accurate, before we get into like the real accuracy of it, do you feel like that depiction that Disney took is quite accurate, or do you think it leaves out some major plot holes?
Well, I think the rivalry and ultimately the way that Moses chooses to associate with the people of God rather than the people of Egypt. Obviously, there are some Disney embellishments and all of that. But
Yeah.
I think
Yeah.
I took my daughters to see that the first week it came out. They were really young, and I was probably more excited than they were, to get to go see that.
I just rewatched it and just the score for it is amazing. Just the music in it and then the cast of like really nice like A-list stars that are in the movie, just phenomenal. Like Sandra Bullock, like oh my gosh.
Yeah, well,
But getting back to
I'm
the
going all the
topic
way
today.
back to the Ten Commandments, and so I've got an even older perspective on Moses from that movie and everything.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, getting back to the facts and what his life actually looked like, his humble beginnings. I mean, can we kind of set the stage for why his mother put him in the basket, just so we like fully understand why that even happened? Like, why was there such a huge infanticide, like of the killing of all of these children happening, that his mother felt the need to put Moses in a basket and float him down the Nile?
Yeah, we read in Exodus chapter 1 that the Pharaoh saw that that Israel was becoming a great and numerous people, which actually was the promise that God had made to Abraham from the very beginning. Your people are going to be as numerous as the stars of the sky, the sand in the seashore. But by the end of the book of Genesis, when Jacob goes down to Egypt, there's only 70 of them. So it seems like that must be a pretty cloudy night if that's the stars in the sky. But in chapter 1, Israel is becoming a great and a numerous people, which is God's covenant promise. Uh, the Pharaoh sees that as a threat and says, I'm going to try to stop this. And really, he's standing in the way of God's blessing of his people. The whole story of Moses' mother putting him in the basket. And again, I think this illustrates some of the ways that the story of Moses connects to other parts of the Bible. The word there for basket, the only other place in the Hebrew Bible that word appears is talking about Noah's Ark. It's the word for ark. And so in the same way that you have Noah
Oh,
in an ark being spared, in the water, you have Noah, or Moses in a sense, being put in a little ark, and God is saving and delivering. And this is the beginning of, an even larger deliverance and redemption than what happens with than with Noah and his family. So forgive me if I talk about
oh
Moses and the
my
ark.
gosh.
And those are
Wow.
that's the beginning of some of these kind of narrative parallelisms and typologies that we begin to see with Moses. But yeah, that's what's going on there in that opening story.
Oh my gosh. Whoa, that wasn't even, I didn't even think about that. I mean, I was getting so caught up in the logistics of like, was that a common thing that like women back then as Hebrews were doing? They were just like, gotta save my son, put him in the basket and see what happens. And he just ended
But
up
I
at the
think
king's
it's
house. Or, um,
Yeah, I think it's just God superintending all of that, and it's really an act of desperation in light of the way that the Hebrew baby boys were being put to death. But I think that connection is emphasizing, hey, God's doing His work of redemption here and His work of salvation, and the deliverance of Moses will ultimately lead to an even greater deliverance for the people of Israel, and this is the beginning of what's happening there.
Absolutely. So, moving forward in Moses' life, he grows up with the Pharaoh and the Pharaoh's son, and he kind of grows up in royalty. But then, once he does kind of cast himself out because of murdering somebody, he encounters a burning bush. I mean, I'm paraphrasing heavily at this point, but that burning bush. Are we to understand that as like a real miracle, like something that's supernatural, or a metaphor, or like a vision?
Yeah, it's a real way that God is revealing Himself, and sometimes in the Hebrew Bible we have kind of an invisible Yahweh who is speaking from heaven and those kinds of things. But you also have places where we have a visible manifestation of the Lord and the Lord's presence. And I think that's what we have here with the burning bush, that this is a genuine, theophany experience of God's presence. And we often see this when God is calling a prophet or a deliverer or a messenger. There's often a way that God reveals Himself so that they see the power and the greatness of the God that will be with them to enable them to do this. So, Isaiah sees a vision of God in the temple, seated on the throne, high and lifted up, and doesn't really see much more than the bottom part of his robe. But the presence of God is often associated with fire and these types of things. And you have a supernatural, this bush is burning, but is not consumed. And it's holy ground because the presence of God is there.
Is there any clarification that we need to make? Because to me, I would only associate fire with like hell and Satan because of like the fiery pits. But here, like God also shows up. Is that a limiting mindset that I have by only associating that with like evil?
Yeah, I think sometimes the idea of fire is just the awesome presence, the burning. I mean, the glory of God in the Old Testament, the kavod, is often associated with a bright light. So I think just the luminous presence of God. But fire also has the idea of purging and something that's holy and cleansing and those types of things. And then other times, fire has the idea of consuming, and the idea of more of judgment would be something that comes out of that.
Okay, got it. Yeah, I definitely think I just like put it in the box of anything on fire is going to go with hell, and anything that's like
Right. No,
light and fluffy and easy is heaven. I don't know.
yeah, yeah. I mean, like with Ezekiel, when he sees, and again, another vision that we're talking about, he sees God on this portable throne, and the presence of God there is a glowing, burning presence. And you kind of see this association with the presence of God and fire throughout the Hebrew Bible.
Yes. Oh my gosh, Ezekiel. I was just doing a live the other day and everyone's like, we should read Ezekiel. And they're like, it's UFOs. And I'm like, I don't think this is
It's not,
UFOs.
yeah, it's not UFOs. And when you see the ancient Near Eastern background of that, it's the Lord is a mighty warrior appearing to both judge and to ultimately save his people, but a very terrifying presence. And I think the fire adds to kind of the terrifying nature of when God appears. We get a sense of that with Moses as well, for sure.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, getting back on track with Moses, the miracles. This is something like, how should we approach miracles as a whole? Because I feel like that's a pretty complicated topic of like, why don't we see miracles? How do they work? Like, is it only based on the presence of faith? Like, before we get into like all of the miracles that Moses encountered, how should we approach miracles as a whole in the Bible?
Well, I think that miracles are often a way of God demonstrating that He's at work. Not
Mm,
just in a validating way, but it's validating that this person is truly a representative of God and those types of things. But miraculous works are often associated with God's salvation and God's deliverance. And I think that's why you have a really heavy concentration of miracles. In the Old Testament, primarily it's around the time of Moses, and then
yeah.
later around the time of Elijah, when God is doing something new, when God is authenticating a messenger, or God is moving salvation history forward. It seems like you have the miracles with Moses, later with Elijah. And then again, that carries over to God is doing something new with Jesus and validating and authenticating that. We don't always see prophets in the Old Testament performing miracles. So I think it usually indicates God's doing something new. This is a special messenger on a mission from God, and we need to listen and pay attention to what God's up to in these cases.
Wow, I wish God would do something new so public today and like experience more miracles today. Or is that so ignorant of me to say like God's performing miracles every day? I just like they're not happening right in front of me.
Right. I think, today, I think we see more miraculous things done more in answers to prayer and those types of things. But God's still doing the supernatural. He's still healing. He's still revealing himself to people that need to know him. But, yeah, definitely, I think maybe a little differently than what we see in the time of Moses or the New Testament era with the apostles and that type of thing.
Yeah, very different. I mean, I have a couple examples of the miracles that, like, when I was reading through Exodus, I was like, how did this work? How did this work? How did this work? Like, which one of these are symbolic? Like, right away, Exodus 4:6, the hand becoming leprous when God is talking with Moses and he's like, put your hand in your cloak, pull it out, and it's leprous, put it back in, and it's fully healed. I think that to me, it reminds me of a testimony that I had with the Messianic rabbi. And he's like, in his testimony, he was looking in a mirror and God revealed like his skin decaying. Like he was like, it was a vision from the Lord of like my skin falling off. And it was like God has dominion over our like physical bodies. And I think we don't understand how what that control can look like is that God can change the condition of our skin in an instant and then he can restore it back to health. Am I following the right way or is there something I'm missing here?
Yeah, and I think Moses himself at the very beginning needs to be convinced that God is truly calling him and at work. And so the miraculous appearance with the burning bush, what you mentioned with with the leprosy and all of those things at the beginning are there primarily to validate what God's doing for Moses himself needs that before he can go and try to convince the people that he's God's messenger as well.
Yeah, I would imagine I would need some convincing too that God's really got my back in the most
Uh,
supernatural way. If he's like, you're going to lead the
Absolutely.
people, and he's like, I don't know. And he's like, really? Take your hand out.
Yeah.
Take your hand out of your coat.
Go confront the most powerful man in the world right now and tell him that God said to let his people go. I mean, yeah, I want to know that some type of
Yeah.
supernatural presence is there.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, that makes a lot of sense. But even like the rod becoming a snake, I like, again, this is like Bible, this is Sunday school mentality of like, when I think of the Prince of Egypt, when Moses goes up to the Pharaoh and he's like, look, my rod just became a snake. I'm dealing with the Almighty God. You need to believe what I'm saying. He's using this kind of as like leverage. I know that's not really what happens in the Bible, but like, if I'm understanding it from like the Disney version, the Pharisee has his like magicians who are like, I can also replicate that. I can, there's charlatans that can also replicate that. What can you say when it comes to like God kind of defying a rod into a snake? Is that more, again, like where's the symbolism versus like the reality of God transforming objects into animals?
Yeah, well, I think again when we talk about validating and authenticating, now the miracle is creating a message for the Pharaoh, and the significance that I think is attached with the snakes there is that the Pharaoh, the symbol of the Pharaoh's power is the cobra, the uraeus, a snake. And often, if you see the headdress of the Pharaoh from the Old Testament era, he has a snake on there. So I think what's going on there is that the miracle is conveying the king that Moses represents is more powerful than the king that he's opposing and standing against. And the Pharaoh, when Moses says, hey, Yahweh says, let my people go, what do I care that the God of a bunch of slaves is saying, that I should do this? But that snake, it's really kind of it's the first power lunch in history, because the power that's behind Moses is greater than the authority and power and kingship of the Pharaoh himself. And I think that's the significance of what's going on there with the snake miracle and the Egyptian. But those magicians have legitimate spiritual power to do those kinds of things. And I think there's demonic power and powers of darkness that are with the Pharaoh and the Egyptian gods, and the Lord's going to take all of those things on, and Pharaoh eventually will lose very badly as God demonstrates his power.
Yeah, 100%. I just had a conversation last week about polytheistic gods with another PhD, and he is essentially saying like the plagues that God specifically sent to Pharaoh represent the, like power over the gods, like power over water turning into blood, over the frogs, over the locusts, over these things that like these polytheistic gods were gods of. They were like frog like animal, these like water gods. God showed that he had power over them. So they were very specific types of plagues that were directly hitting on the things that Pharaoh thought he was the king of.
Yeah, it seems like, and commentators will do this, they'll develop how each one of the plagues somehow is related to. So, you have an Egyptian god that protects the Nile. Well, the Nile turns into blood. The sun god is a major deity among the Egyptians. So there's darkness over the land.
Yeah.
And they believed that the Pharaoh was, the son of God, God incarnate. So the death of Pharaoh's firstborn son is a challenge to that idea as well. And so, in some way, at least
Whoa.
with the majority of these plagues, they can be attached in some way to a specific deity or maybe specific theological beliefs that the Egyptians had.
Whoa. Oh my gosh. The symbolism, the foreshadowing. Oh my gosh. I didn't even think about the
Right.
firstborn son.
Well, and the frogs that are associated with reproduction and think, well, it's like, okay, you like reproduction. I'm going to fill the land with frogs and those types of things. Again, God is
Yeah.
demonstrating His power over the gods of Egypt. And again, we start thinking about how the Bible cycles back to these types of things. The judgments that are found in the Book of Revelation are often very similar to the plagues that God brought on the Egyptians. So now, as God is judging the whole world and preparing for His kingdom, the judgments there kind of take us back to the plagues that we see with Pharaoh and the Egyptians.
Yeah. It really does link all together. Okay. I'm going to go for, the big one. Um, the cloud of fire. The cloud of fire is insane when he's leading people out of Egypt and he's guiding them with a like pillar of fire and then like a pillar of light. I'm so sorry if you can hear those sirens. Like
No,
I
that's
live right next to a fire station. Okay,
not a
good.
problem.
I can't even fathom having like a pillar of fire guiding me through the night and then like a pillar of a cloud. Like why don't we get that? I want to see that. Or do you feel like we do and
Well,
it's just like the Old Testament version?
we have the Holy Spirit to give us direction and guidance, and we're not journeying through a wilderness, going to a specific destination and that type of thing. But and that's what makes Israel's failures in the wilderness all the more significant. When they leave Mount Sinai, maybe I'm jumping ahead here a little bit, but they've been at Mount
It's
Sinai
okay.
for 11 months. They've been there, they've been in the presence of God, they've seen the glory and the greatness of God, and they set out, and we think, yeah, they have every reason to be successful. God is with them. They have a divine GPS that's going to take them everywhere they're supposed to go. They have the Lord teaches the priest how to bless his people. The Lord bless you and keep you. So they have that. They have the Ark of the Covenant, and God is the one leading them out into battle against their enemies. It's like, how could you fail? God has given you everything that you could possibly need to make a successful journey and be in the promised land in a few weeks. And they end up roaming around for 40 years. And I think that and really they rebel against God when they leave Mount Sinai 3 days after they leave, after they've been in the presence of God. It's like God gave them everything that they could possibly need or want.
Yeah.
And yet, sin and rebellion leads to the failure and the first generation not even getting to go into the land.
Yeah. Yeah. You think like them coming out of Egypt with all of their polytheistic gods, like the gods that they were relying on, that they were comfortable with, they immediately kind of have to like cleave away into a new god that they are unfamiliar with that is doing these supernatural things, and God's like, see
Yes.
the pillar of fire, see the rod and the snake, see the the parting of the sea, like I am the God. And they're like, yeah, but I still just met you, and like I don't know, I've got like a pretty good track record with my other polytheistic pagan gods, so like I'm gonna cleave to my golden calf that like definitely helps me sleep at night. Like I sympathize for them, because don't we do the same thing? Like as much as God's like, I'm good, I provided you life, I fed you,
Yeah.
here we are, like, but like I feel safer when I scroll TikTok than when I worship you. So I'm gonna do that God instead of this God.
Yeah, it's always easier to have a God, first of all, that you maybe have past experiences with. And we know that the prophet Ezekiel says that Ezekiel chapter 20, that Israel, they've been idol worshipers from the very beginning. So they were worshiping the gods of Egypt. And I think partly, what God is doing often with the Israelite is that he's weaning them away from the beliefs that they've had, and their Egyptian way of looking at life and all of those kinds of things. Even what Moses teaches us in the creation story about humanity being created in the image of God is somewhat of a polemic against Egyptian theology. They believe that the first, the pharaohs, they're the image of God. They're the representation of God. The Bible democratizes that, says we're all kings, and we're not slaves. We're ruling as God's
Yeah.
co-regents, and just the value of humanity and the value of human life that
Yeah.
emerges from that. But Moses
Yeah.
is correcting the false beliefs that they've learned in Egypt, and so yeah, that's a big part of what has to happen here. Again, partly why I think that God is moving in these miraculous ways. After the Exodus in Exodus 14, there's this really important statement. It says, when the Israelites saw this, they put their trust in the Lord and in Moses, his servant, but they needed to see that before they could be convinced to really truly trust. And they're
Yeah.
going to
A hundred
constantly
percent.
constantly waver in that again, because of that tendency we have as humans to do that.
Right. Like, I think it is a little hypocritical of us to look at these Jews and say, like, what, why did you keep going back to your pagan gods? Why did you keep going back? You were just so sinful. Like, this was so unnecessary, but it's like, they just came out of a belief system that like God, like had to kind of compensate with like, I'm going to bring out the whole row of miracles that I could possibly pull out. And because you guys, I really got to break your brain to like rewire and like focus on me.
Right.
And we're like, didn't you see God once? You should be a diehard believer. It's like, well, are we diehard believers? And we like have the written book of all of this. We have like the account of this, and we still aren't diehard believers.
And we go back to our sinful ways and practices, and the Israelites keep saying, we wish we could just go back to the way it was when we were in Egypt and we had, such good food and everything
Rather
was,
be a
it's
slave.
like,
Yeah.
no, it was not good, but it was what they knew. It was comfortable. It was safe. And the difference between
Yeah.
faith and we have to trust in things we can't see. And I think that was one of the things that was especially hard for Israel is like these other people have visible representations of their gods, and we serve an invisible God. That takes a lot of faith to believe and accept that.
Percent. Some of the other miracles, just because, again, like I was going through Exodus and I was like, how does this work? How does this work? How does this work? Is the splitting of the sea. I mean, that just is like the climax of the movie. I mean, everybody just knows like Noah and the flood, Moses and the splitting of the seas. Like it is kind of this like quintessential, sorry, part of the story. But is there more to it that we miss when we read it because we get so caught up in the theatrics of him splitting the sea?
I think the thing that I would say is theologically the most important thing about the Exodus is the Exodus it's like the central act of salvation in the Old Testament. So in the same way that you have the cross and the resurrection of Jesus in the New Testament, the Exodus is that primary act of redemption that God performs in the Old Testament. So beyond the miracle and the wind and the way that God, saves the Israelites and then brings the water back down on the Egyptians, that act becomes the way that God will save and deliver his people in the future. And so every year they would remember what God did at Passover. And then, the future acts of salvation that God does in the Old Testament are viewed as being like a new Exodus. So when we fast forward to Joshua and the conquest, what's the first thing that happens before Joshua takes the land? They cross the Jordan River, and when the priests step into the river with the ark, the waters split, and it's like, well, God did that once. Why doesn't He come up with something new? Well, they're not looking for special effects here. This is saying the power of God that brought the people out of Egypt is also the power of God that's with Joshua as they're taking the land. And again, salvation history is moving forward. And then when the people
Yeah.
go into captivity later, when they go to Babylon, the prophet Isaiah and other prophets will say, when God brings the people back from the captivity, this will be like a second Exodus. And there's at least a couple dozen passages in the book of Isaiah where God's talking about dividing the waters and overcoming the sea and leading the people. And when you go through the waters, I will be with you and they will not harm you. And it's like, why is he talking about this? They're not going to have to cross any waters when they go home from Babylon. But the deliverance from Babylon is a new Exodus. And so the imagery of going through the sea and crossing the sea and all that. And Jeremiah says this new Exodus is going to be so great, Jeremiah 16, 14, and 15, that they won't even really talk about the old Exodus anymore. What God is doing in the future is going to be an even greater act of deliverance. So I think that's to look maybe a little bit more at just the theological significance of them crossing the sea, and this becomes the paradigm for how God delivers in the rest of Old Testament history.
Oh, wow, I love that it is like kind of like what you said, like it's like, don't you have any more tricks, God? But it is just like the same power that we saw in Moses splitting the waters we see later and him showing up again. Like it doesn't diminish, it shows up again. Like what a powerful moment that is in the Exodus that like other prophets get to experience it. Okay, moving forward, because I have so much more that I want to talk to you about. Just one
Okay.
little quickie I want to clarify with you because I saw this and I'm like, gosh, there must be more to this because I'm like, I don't know what this is. But when it's in Exodus 16, there's the manna and the quail from heaven that they're like, what are we going to eat? And he's like, I'm going to send little frosted flakes down from the heavens every morning. And you collect everything that you need, but don't let it last until tomorrow morning. If you do, like throw it out. Is this supposed to be some sort of lesson on don't store up our riches? Or why does he specify that?
With the manna, and remember they could keep it for 2 days when on the Sabbath because it just emphasizes, I think, that they're going to have to trust God to provide for them every day. You can't go to the manna store on
Mm.
Monday and it's going to last for the rest of the week. It was a daily provision, and again, it's they're going to have to trust God that daily He will do this. And at the beginning, I think they are kind of wondering that, and so yeah, let's get as much of this as we can. And when they wake up the next day, it's spoiled because God's going to provide this every day.
He's really like breaking them into submission of like, you're not going to
Yeah,
have
yeah.
food. Like, I will give you food each day.
Yeah, yeah. Give us this day our daily bread is kind of, and it will be a daily thing where, and you look at the wilderness where Israel was at, there are no, Safeways or Food Lions or Kroger's or anything like, I mean, they are in a barren, desolate place, and God is the only one who can provide for them. And I think the daily lesson of the manna just, they learn that really quickly. And food and water become they're the primary tests for the people. That's what they're, again, 3 days after the Exodus, they've seen God divide the sea. 3 days later, like, what are we going to eat or what are we going to drink? Same thing when they leave Sinai. 3 days later, they're complaining, we don't have any food. And so this was going to be a major way of trusting God.
Yeah. Wow. What a personal application. I'm just thinking like how where I'm at in my life, like thinking of like, well, you're in a desert and every day God will give you the food for that day. And then tomorrow you'll have to go right back to him and ask again because it's only going to come from him. Like, whoa, you just like
Yeah.
gave me a whole sermon in my head. So thank you. Moving
Well,
on,
maybe,
there's another
but
thing
maybe
that
we
kind of
see
stood out.
that more. Maybe we see that more kind of just with the way that God spiritually sustains us on a daily basis. We have food in our refrigerator, money in our bank account, but definitely when we think about God just spiritually sustaining us, that lesson probably becomes a little more clear to us.
100%, 100%. If we look at what was it, Exodus 13:14, it basically it's a positive light, but it's saying like we're going to, I think it was circumcision, but it was like, I want you to do this because it's going to like be a sign on your forehead. It'll be a sign on your hand of the works that God has done. To me, that was like the good and holy version of the mark of the beast. Did I pick up on the right thing there, or is that so unrelated?
Well, it is a mark that would show their identity as the people of God. And it wasn't just some random thing. Hey, let's come up with circumcision, because the promise to Abraham was that God would make him a great nation and God would give him seed and those kinds of things. And again, as you pass that on from father to son, it was a reminder God will continue to make us a great people and a great nation, and will fulfill those promises that He made. But yeah, it is an identifying mark for the people of Israel as God's people, and it's the sign
Got it.
it's the sign of the Mosaic covenant, or the Abrahamic covenant. I'm sorry.
Got it. So we are living with a God that does want that sign across our forehead on our hand that shows us that we are on his team the same way Satan would want the same for his.
True. And, the image of circumcision, even later in the Old Testament, becomes more of a circumcision of the heart. And that's like in Deuteronomy chapter
Mm.
30, verse 6. And other, so God is going to surgically cut away, whatever it is that causes his people to rebel or to be stiff-necked and obstinate in doing what God has commanded them, and God is going to transform their hearts. I think that's, God's going to do surgery on their hearts. Other places, like Ezekiel says, God's going to give them a new heart. He'll replace the old one. Jeremiah says God is going to write his law on the heart and sort of overwrite their sin. I think all of those images are saying the
Hmm.
same thing. God's going to internally transform his
Hmm.
people so that ultimately they will have the power and capacity to obey him. And that's what we see with the law repeatedly, is that Israel, really under the old covenant as a nation and as a people did not fully have that enablement that they needed to live out God's commands.
Okay. I'm gonna keep going. And one of the things that I kept picking up on is, and we're kind of going backwards right now with
Sure.
Pharaoh and going back to before he kind of let the people go, is it says repeatedly how God hardened Pharaoh's heart. So God had a choice there to either soften or harden. And when it came to the plagues, he's like, I'm going to harden his heart. So he says no to Moses. So then God can then show his greatness and let the plagues happen. And he does the same thing with Pharaoh says, go ahead, let them go. And then he's like, and then God hardened his heart. So then his army pursued them. Why, to me, that it sounds like God is like making someone look bad so God can look good. And that doesn't seem right or good or fair, but who am I to judge? So help me understand like why and how God is doing that.
I think it's a little, there's a little bit more to the story than just God simply saying, "Hey, I'm gonna make this guy obstinate so that I can make myself look better."
Okay.
If you read the story of the plagues, here's the part that I think is interesting. I think in the first five plagues, the text is going to be very clear that Pharaoh hardened his own heart. Okay, so in other words, he, by his
Okay.
own choice, his own willful rebellion, refuses to assent to what God is wanting him to do. It's only in the latter plagues then that God hardens Pharaoh's heart. So what I would see, God is doing here is he's not just coercing the Pharaoh into something, but this is the Pharaoh's own rebellion. God is merely confirming him in that rebellion, making him more obstinate as a punishment for his own initial rebellion against God. So it's really the idea of God punishes unbelief with unbelief. Pharaoh's unbelief is what
Oh,
leads him to harden his heart at the beginning, and God, God knows that. God says ahead of time,
yeah.
I'm going to harden Pharaoh's heart and get glory for myself in all of this. But when there's the actual working out of the interaction between God and Pharaoh, Pharaoh hardens his heart first, and then the Lord punishes him by saying, "Okay, I'm going to take that unbelief that you have to its ultimate extreme and ultimately destroy you because of your own pride and arrogance." And honestly, what Paul says in Romans 1 about how when humanity rebels against God and God gives them over to their sinful desires and that type of thing, it's really the same principle at work there that we see going on with the Pharaoh as well. So God's not just,
That makes sense.
exercising his sovereignty and pulling the puppet strings on Pharaoh. There's a real give and take and interaction between the two of them as all of this is going on.
Wow. He rewards unbelief with further unbelief on his end. That's insane and so scary. Oh my gosh.
Scary, yeah,
Okay.
yeah. We see this in other places as well in the Bible. I think that where kind of this principle works itself out.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, moving on to Mount Sinai, because again, I was just going through this book highlighting things. Mount Sinai was really crazy to read because it kind of seems like it happens twice, where he like goes up, gets these commandments, comes down with the tablet, he breaks it because he sees everything, he goes back up, God gives him a tablet again. So it kind of like happens twice. And based off our conversation, maybe that's just to, like hammer it in of like really building this trust in the Lord. But what is like logistic, this is me being like a realistic person and kind of you bringing me back into the faith of God, but like what is the academic interpretation of Moses staying on a mountain for 40 days and 40 nights to receive the Ark of the Covenant? Like, is that where time turns off? Like, how did Moses sustain himself for a mountain for that long? Like, realistically, do we look at it with like logic of like how logistically how did that work?
Yeah. I mean, I take the 40 days and 40 nights to just be a time of fasting that is similar to what Jesus did in the wilderness. And, I think a
Okay.
lot of this has to do with an intense experience of God. What I would see going on with the way that the Lord reveals himself at Sinai is more that the Lord is impressing his greatness, his power, his holiness, the fire, the smoke, the mountains, shaking and quaking. Uh, all of that is
Yeah,
designed to make Israel realize we need to take God's word very seriously.
got it.
And they will say they'll say to Moses, "We don't want to speak directly to God. Why don't you go up and speak with him and get the message and come down and tell us?" And that ends up becoming the reason that Moses really becomes kind of the prototype of the prophet. But I think all of this experience of God on Sinai again, God's teaching the people about himself. And part of this is that God is teaching them about his holiness. So only Moses is allowed to go directly into the presence of God. And then there's another group of people that are allowed to go a little bit closer. But the people as a whole, they put a
Yeah.
fence and a barrier around it, like, don't cross this or you're going to die. And really, Sinai
Yeah.
almost becomes physically like the tabernacle, where you have the outer court, you have the holy place, you have the most
Mm.
holy place. Like, again, this is sacred space. This is holy ground where God is meeting with his people. And so he has to impress his holiness upon them so that they will understand the urgency and importance of obeying the commandments. When when Moses breaks the commandments and goes back up, I guess when I read that as a kid, I always thought, Moses lost his temper there and probably shouldn't have smashed something as important as the. But
Yeah.
really, I think he's more symbolically saying, you have broken the cup by worshiping the golden calf while God's still up on the mountain getting the commandments. It's almost like they've cheated on God on the honeymoon. And so Moses is
I
symbolically
get
saying, you've broken this covenant. God graciously forgives them and allows, by giving the commandments a second time, God is graciously allowing them to stay in this covenant relationship.
Wow. Yeah. Seeing it that through those eyes definitely makes it make more sense because I think just like in my modern sense, you like read Exodus and you're like, not even an animal can go, like any creature on the mountain while God,
Right.
like that cloud's descendants dying. Like, what if it's just like not in the same part of the mountain, Like, what if like a poor bunny gets on that mountain, And it seems so extreme to us, but you really do think about the transformation of these people of like a polytheistic within the Egyptian, like within 40 days, they have to transform. Like that is a very short period of time.
Yeah, and he's setting them up for how they will have to approach God and worship him when they come to the tabernacle and later to the temple as well. Not everyone can just walk into the presence of God. You have to, because of sin, there's a need for sacrifice, there's a need for barriers, separation. If sinful people go into the presence of God, it would be like you and I, seeing a down power wire in the street and grabbing hold of it. That's a dangerous thing to do, and the presence of God is very dangerous as well. Even Aaron's sons die for going too close into the presence of God on the opening day of the tabernacle, like the first day of worship. God kills Aaron's two sons to say, listen, you have to be very careful as sinful people how you come into my presence and how you approach me, and you have to worship God on my terms. You have to worship me on my terms, not in any way that you choose or in the ways that the pagan people around you have chosen to do that.
So it's not a sense of cruelty that we should take away. It's a sense of like seriousness that he's trying to like implore on these people.
Right. I think it's God is firing a warning shot across the bow, saying that, look, coming into my presence is a great privilege, but it's also something that if people come into God in an unclean or an unholy condition, you can die. And the ministry of the priesthood, was a gracious way of God providing access to his presence and access to his forgiveness. But the people themselves just couldn't directly approach God. And I think, all of this is really setting up the way that Israel will worship until the death of Jesus.
Yeah. I really like what you said of like, you don't get to choose how you worship God. Like, I think I had a comment on a video where someone's like, doesn't God just want us to worship us in the way that like is the most natural for us because we're such different people? Like, doesn't God want to meet us where we're at? And of course, like this is modern day and that's Old Testament. So it's kind of
Jesus
not apples
gets
to apples, but
us.
kind of.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Jesus knows my heart. Like, I'm into him, but like I worship him through yoga. You know what I mean? Like he
Right.
knows. And kind of like what you just said is like, it is a privilege to experience God, and He's very specific in the ways He builds the tabernacle, but also how you approach Him. Like, I think that is very humbling for today's ears to hear.
Yeah, it definitely gives us a more God-centered perspective, and the book of Exodus is really stressing that because chapters 25 to 31 God gives Moses all these instructions about how to construct the tabernacle. And it's like, man, this is like, God's almost like a bridezilla. Every detail has to be right. Even the incense, I want it to smell like this. And then right in the middle of that, in 32 to 34, is when they worship the golden calf. They did it on their terms, and they're punished, and it's, pretty serious. And then what you have in chapters 35 to 41 is that then they build the tabernacle. They do it exactly the way that God told them to. And it's kind of monotonous for us as we read through that, but it's simply stressing, like, here's what happens when you worship God your way, the judgment that comes, and then here's the glory of God shows up at the end of the book when they've done it God's way.
Am trudging through Leviticus at this moment, and wow, you just gave it more
Yeah.
life, so thank you. I think that this is kind of a good moment for us to transfer like the specifics of it. It's really hard to see like why is God, like you said, being a bridezilla about these very weird things of like just starting off in Exodus, like why did he request a burnt offering on an altar? Like what does this do for God? Because to me it sounds very paganistic to sacrifice an animal in order to appease a god. Like isn't that what they were doing for like Zeus and Ra? Like if God is totally different and almighty, why does he need us to sacrifice to him? Isn't he almighty in that? But you kind of mentioned it before of like is to cleanse sins. I simply don't understand that.
Yeah, I don't think it's the idea of appeasing the wrath of an angry God as much as it is dealing with that sin. Without the shedding of blood, there's no remission of sin. All of this is an object lesson. Someone said,
Oh.
Israel's place of worship was a slaughterhouse. And you can imagine just the blood and the bleeding of animals. And just, I try to visualize what that's like. And it must have been pretty horrific. But I think all of this is trying to, more than teaching God's anger, it's teaching God's holiness, but also the grace and the forgiveness that God provides, because he is allowing access to where these animals are dying in the place of sinners who deserve to die and be judged and destroyed instead. So there's that
Okay.
grace element. There's that
Yeah,
grace
I
and
think
mercy.
that okay, that makes sense, that kind of retribution of sin through the spilling of blood. And then you see that verse in Exodus 21, 22 to 25. Again, I was telling you, I was going line by line, is it's talking about take an eye for an eye, that eye retribution. And why do we need that line when Jesus comes and says, turn the other cheek?
Are you asking what do we learn from that as Christians, and is that
I'm asking, like, yeah, why do they seem to contradict each other? Of like God saying,
okay?
take an eye for an eye. Like if someone takes your eye, you take theirs, essentially. Like he's laying out kind of like the logistics of legality and like how to treat someone that's wronged you. But then Jesus comes and he's like, turn the other cheek. So, like, why do we get both?
Okay. Yeah, I think it's important to understand, like, the Bible is God's word, but the Bible did not just drop out of the sky. Oh, here's a magical book, take it up and read it. God always,
It feels like
God,
that
yeah,
sometimes.
yeah, and it does. A strange book at times, especially. But I think partly what's happening with the law is God is revealing his holiness to his people, but he's also revealing that in things that conform to the standards of that day and the standards of justice and things that we see in other. So there's a sense in which the law can reveal the absolute standards of God's holiness, and I think especially like in the Ten Commandments and those types of things. But there are other places where I think the law is meeting the culture where it's at, and in some sense is trying to elevate people being more loving and more gracious and more merciful. And ultimately, it's leading us to understand our need for a savior, our need for deliverance, and how the grace of God is even greater in light of what Jesus has done for us. So there's lots of things about the
Okay.
law that may not in our thinking, they don't fully reflect the perfect or ultimate righteous standard of the New Testament. But God's meeting the culture where they're at. And as they learn about him and understand his gracious character more and more, God will reveal more and more of that, ultimately leading us to, again, I think a greater demonstration of mercy and grace in the work of Christ.
Okay. Okay. That's fair. a couple other things that just to me, I'm like, are we supposed to be doing this? Like, if this is on the Bible, which ones do we obey? Is it talks about in Exodus 29:29 the sacred garments that Aaron and his sons need to wear when they're in the tabernacle. And I understand I'm not running a tabernacle and I'm not appointed priest, but are we supposed to have some sort of sacred garments? Like you hear of that, like again, like I'm not saying I'm an expert, but you hear of that in the Mormon culture. So why do they do that? And then the priests do that. Should I be like, am I missing something at the party here? Like, should I have brought my sacred garments and I'm being unknowingly disobedient? Sorry.
No, I think you're good. And this is how I would. I don't think you need. I don't think you need to take your sacred garments to church or anything like that. There's two ways that I think Christians have tried to explain the law. One approach is to take there's the moral laws, the civil laws, and the ceremonial laws. The moral laws are still in place and applicable to us. The civil laws and the ceremonial laws only related to Israel's worship or government and those kinds of things. The problem is it's a little hard to really separate those categories. The law wasn't revealed in that way. And the law isn't given in, well, here's the moral section. But the way that I would understand this, that I think is a little better, is that the specifics of the law, all 613 of the commandments that God gave to Moses, that was part of God's covenant with Israel. And so they were obligated to fulfill and to keep those things. But I think now that there's been a covenantal change in the new covenant, the law remains the eternal word of God. All 613 commandments are still part of God's word, but they're not, the exact details of how we live in covenant with Yahweh, or how we live in covenant with God in light of our relationship with Jesus. I think instead the law teaches us timeless principles, and we learn from these timeless principles the way that we are supposed to, obey God, relate to God. And I would say here's an example of that. You mentioned the burnt offering a little while ago. Thankfully, the New Testament makes clear for us that we don't have to offer sacrifices. Jesus has offered the perfect sacrifice. But that doesn't mean, well, hey, those chapters in Leviticus don't really apply to me anymore. Because Paul in Romans chapter 12 says, I beseech you, brothers, to present your bodies a living sacrifice, wholly acceptable unto God. So I think what Paul is saying is we don't still offer sacrifices. The New Testament clarifies we don't do that anymore. But the principle that a burnt offering reflected complete and total devotion to God, that principle remains in place. And the way that we are devoted to God and living our lives, we are living sacrifices rather than sacrifices that are placed on the altar. So with the priesthood, we're the priesthood of believers. We offer our lives as continual service to God, but we offer to God the sacrifices of praise and thanksgiving and a holy life. Those garments remind us, I think, of our privilege and our position, and the importance of being pure and clean as we go into the presence of God. But the New Testament clarifies for us, the details of the law that we are to continue to practice, that are repeated, versus the things that we should just treat as principles and standards. And I know
I
there was
see.
that was a
It's a
that
little
was
of a
a
both and.
that was a very that was a very involved, detailed answer.
Yeah, I'm not gonna lie. I'm not gonna end that response and be like, got it. So these are the ones to obey and these are the ones to let go. Because I think it is difficult to be like, well, you're right. Like he has given us a perfect sacrifice. There are some things that we just no longer have to do because Jesus was the replacement for it. But those things that we should keep doing, which one of those? What are the things that we should
Yeah.
keep doing that we should take right out of the Old Testament and be like, those should still be happening today, so we can
Okay.
be held accountable, stay obedient.
Yeah, I think the laws that are the commandments that are either repeated or reaffirmed in the New Testament are the ones, like 9 of the 10 commandments are repeated in the New Testament. So obviously, we're expected and obligated, and so I think we use the New Testament as our grid. Yeah, a lot of times Christians will be accused of yeah, you guys just pick and choose the laws that you want to follow. Like, you ignore those laws about eating shellfish or bacon and those kinds of things, but you take other things from the law of Moses and make them continue to apply it. Well, we're not being, I don't think we're just picking and choosing or being random. We're using the New Testament for our guide. Like, if the New Testament reaffirms those or restates those things, we continue to practice it. Other things that I think were specifically just for the covenant between God and Israel, and those are the things that we learn principles from. Paul even, Paul says we're no longer under the law; we're not under the Mosaic covenant. But Paul, as much as any New Testament writer, used the Old Testament law as a way of teaching believers how to live a moral life, or how to please God. And he even uses the law about not muzzling the ox, or not muzzling an ox when he's treading grain. He uses that to teach that we should pay pastors and missionaries. So, it's not like we have to practice Mosaic farming methods like Deuteronomy 25:4, but even something about not putting a muzzle on an ox teaches us a spiritual principle that helps us to see God's wisdom and that sort of thing.
Okay. Yeah. So it's more of like a logical approach. But do you think that like the things that they celebrated in the Old Testament, like the feasts and the festivals and seasons, it's okay that those things aren't still happening because that was between God and Israel, and we're in a different covenant with God?
Yeah, again, as you see the movement of salvation history, those things were preparing the way for Jesus. Now that the
Mm,
reality and the fulfillment of those feasts are there, we're not obligated to do that. Now, if a New Testament believer wants to celebrate those things, I think there's freedom, especially like for Torah observant Jewish believers that want to continue doing those things. There's nothing unbiblical about that, but you
yeah.
can't impose that. I can't say, well, Cassie, you need to be observing the Feast of Tabernacles, or you're just not really a devout Christian and that sort of thing.
Okay. That feels good to hear. So I appreciate you clarifying that. Wow.
Yeah,
That was a lot. There's a lot to digest when it comes to Moses,
yeah.
and that's just one character.
Yeah, and believe me, we've just touched on a handful of things that we could take this and trace Moses' influence through the entire Bible. Actually,
Oh, that might have to be another episode because this
yeah,
hour
I
flew
I think
by.
that would be fun to talk about further. So,
Okay, I'm going to be in your inbox following up with you after this
okay,
call then. But
yeah, that'd be
just to
great.
remind everybody, I know you did it on the prophecy call, but just in case nobody knows how to get in contact with you, hear more of your work, just like at Liberty or with your outside podcast, do you mind just plugging some of your work?
Yeah, you can, and anybody that would like to contact me by email, you can do that either through my Liberty address, gyates@liberty.edu, or gyates@lwbc.net, which is the church. I'm the senior pastor of Living Word Baptist Church in Forest, Virginia, and we also have a podcast that we do through the church, and Living Word Press is the name of that, and so lwbcpress.com. So yeah, and if I can ever be of help to any of your listeners, and I'm always glad to answer questions and that sort of thing.
You're the best. Thank you for being a resource. That's so nice. I wish I would have known of you back in 2018 when I was starting on this and I could have just emailed you my questions. But I'm going to link all of the lwbcpress.com. I'll put that in the show notes below so people can connect with you. I'll have
Yeah,
your
I
email. And
appreciate it.
then your podcast is called The Dive. Is that correct?
Well, we have a couple different things. We have the dive, we have living in the Word, and so we have a couple of
Got
different
it.
things on our Living WordPress page, and it's really, I'm kind of like you were back in 2018. Partly I'm just getting started, and it's a slow process. This is so I have a lot of I admire what you're doing, because I know this is not easy when all the other things in
Thank you.
life that are going on.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you. I appreciate you saying that. Well, thank you so much for coming on. I appreciate just all the wisdom and clarifications. It's so helpful for Christians to know of. But I will be following up with you after this call to get you back on the show for applications of Moses in the New Testament and kind of how he shows up because that deserves its own
Okay.
hour. But thank you so much, and I'll see you back on the show very soon.
Yeah, thanks, Cassie. Great to talk to you. I really appreciate it very much.